think the Madrecuixe that you guys had previously from us in the mixtape format was also from this family, but made by Don Tomas. And so this is a excuse me, a really nice offering from his kid Eliazar, who his twin brother is still in the States, in Stockton, Cesar. And I haven't seen Cesar in a little while now with COVID, trying to get him some more mezcal soon. But there's a really important story behind Eliazar and his brother's mezcal production that really is connected with migration and their experiences crossing the border and spending time in, picking tobacco in Kentucky, doing work in California in kind of the agricultural belt, and then returning to sort of take on this inheritance that Tomas and Antonia, their mother, had been preparing in their absence. And yeah, happy to speak a little bit more on that if anybody's curious. But the actual batch here is a really nice balance between Tepextate-Bicuixe and Espadín. I think it's all of those plant flavors are noted in the aromas and flavor. It did have a rather elongated fermentation time. Generally, this family kind of caps their ferments around 8 or 9 days. This, however, ran, I think it was 13 days, if I'm not mistaken, with water, plus a 2-day dry fermentation time. So there's certain flavors that happen there, I think, with those extended fermentations that you don't always get with the shorter runs. And it's composed with heads, hearts, and tails, and just about 51%. The lab test came back at 50.9. Yeah, Nikki, you got anything you want to mention about Eliazar, about the family?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this batch in particular, we hadn't been to Lagotche, I think, for probably 6 months since the beginning of the pandemic. And then when Max and I were finally able to make it out to Lagotche, with all the protocol, this was one of the first batches that we tried and immediately fell in love with. And one that Eliazar and Nicolas were both very, very excited for us to try. And I think that for them was particularly special. I don't know what we all think, but this was kind of like a love at first sight batch, and something that we immediately moved on.
The agave all came from one red earth parcel, like a tierra colorada, lots of rocks, limestone. And so the Espadín there is co-planted with other cultivated types like Madrecuixe, plus you have corn, beans, and squash also in this type of milpa system. And then the Bicuixe is just kind of growing wild all over the place. And there's a little Tepextate just on the kind of boundaries of this more cultivatable semi-flat land. And so all of the maguey in this case was all sourced from a super small parameter, and it's a nice little glimpse at this one soil type.
Yeah, and most of the Bicuixe from this plot, I believe, is all Capon, is pretty old Bicuixe, Capon Bicuixe, so very flavorful. Yeah. What do y'all think?
Man,
Great.
For me at least, like, I got the Tepextate right off the bat. I got this big green, fresh, like jalapeno. But then I get that I get all three agaves, like you were saying, like the Bicuixe. I always get this sort of vanilla bean, pound cake, just deliciousness. And then I'm getting this sort of like, I don't know, brown sugar, banana, Espadín thing going as well. And some peppermint, and oh, I love this one so much. When I first opened it up though, like I just opened it and poured it, and I started getting some bitter notes, but they went away pretty quick with the oxygen. I don't know what causes that, but I mean, it's totally mellowed out. And I opened it the day I got it, and it's just better and better every time I sip on this
Yeah.
one, so.
I find that the
Congratulations.
Tepextate,
It's great.
thank you. The Tepextate, I think can really benefit from some oxygen. There's just often a lot of volatility right out of the bottle. But yeah, it does just like completely transform just a few minutes in the glass.
When you said that you went and tried it and this batch really spoke to you, I'm kind of curious, do you buy everything that they make, or what do they do with the rest that you don't take, or how does that work?
There's a very strong local market. So we work with most of the producers in Logoche, but we do not buy everything that people produce. We are not in kind of like exclusive contracts with folks. They service their local community in the region, and then literally like, you know, neighboring villages and in Michoacán. Yeah, there's certainly certain batches that are made with us in mind, and we're in constant contact about like what's being kind of made and what sizes, but it's very hard to know in advance because you just don't know what things are going to yield. People don't know exactly what's ripe. So there is this kind of, right now as we entered into production season, Max and I are just texting back and forth, figuring out what people are distilling and what they're working on. And then we try and get samples and taste everything as fast as possible and make decisions.
Cool.
So is there's a Logoche cooperative, right? I mean, they're
Yes.
together. And so is there a spot that you can go in Michoacán and just try everybody's stuff in one place? Like, does the cooperative have like a base?
Not yet, but it's something that they're working on. So hopefully, you know, towards the end of, well, we're already in March, but 2022, maybe even the end of this year, we're really hoping that kind of collectively we can help get something off the ground where when people do visit, there's a centralized space. And I think everybody's on board. It's just there's a long list of priorities, and with the lack of visitors currently, that's kind of taken a position on the back burner. But it's happening. They're installing bathrooms right now, so that's definitely.
Yeah, I mean, before COVID, the best way to try everything, you know, people made was at one of the parties. It became a tradition. We did our 1-year anniversary party in like 2018, I guess, and everybody in the community brought like 1 or 2 things that they had made, and so it was just an incredible bar of everybody's creations. So this is now kind of what happens when you go to a baptism. Well, not now, but it was, and we miss it. We hope that by 2022 it'll be a possibility again. Yeah, you got to know the right people.
I have a question for your ensembles. Are the magueyes always cooked together, or is there ever cold blending that's involved in the process?
So for the most part, traditional ensembles are cooked together, fermented together, and distilled together. However, there have been some experiments. Willie and Ramon, who are 2 brothers, who form part of a Rancho Tres, Los Tres Carnales, they have done some interesting experiments where they've mixed, this was like, I think, Max, correct me if I'm wrong, it was the puntas of cucharillo and then the común de jabalí.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's an interesting Frankenstein.
Yeah, it was
Whoa.
they've definitely done some experiments, but that's not traditionally what, like, an ensemble in, you know, mezcal lingo refers to what is, you know, cooked together, fermented together, and distilled together. However, you know, people do ensembles and cold blends kind of unceremoniously, often because there's a space issue, or because, you know, you have these little odds and ends, and in this case they wanted to see what would happen, and it ended up being quite delicious.
Do they ever, if they're trying to fulfill a bigger order than they have a batch for, will they blend 2 batches cold
For
that
sure.
way?
For sure. Yeah, I was having a big conversation with Lalo actually about what is a batch. And we're like, is it the container? Is it the time of the harvest? Is it the oven? So there's a lot of ways to look at kind of batch size. For us, usually batch size just means like, whatever maguey was separated from an oven that was, distilled together, that's a batch. But then sometimes it's like whatever fits into one tambo, one, like 200-liter like plastic thing, and it's container. So, there's different measurements. And I think that depending on who you talk to, you might get a different answer.
Actually, I think working as a destilado de agave allows us to have access to these really small batches that otherwise probably would be blended together.
Would be blended together, yeah, for sure.
There's a really wonderful Madrecuixe on the market right now that I know is created in such fashion. And yeah, they can be wonderful mezcales, but one of the benefits of working on this level and with these kind of relationships is able to get I don't know, kind of what to me is a little extra interesting, but that's just my very American perspective as well.
But it's also, one of the cool things about this service and about the Agave Mixtape is that what you're getting are these tiny little batches, and they're just completely exclusive to like this. So, I mean, it's not easy to get this size batch on the market necessarily. And they are generally cold blended. Yeah.
Oh, just a quick question, because did you mention that it has the heads and the tails in here?
It's really nice to see you, Dustin. Yes, it is composed with heads, hearts, and tails. Puntas,
is that uncommon? Is it generally just the hearts that are in?
In most kind of an industrialized or most commercial mezcal, that is definitely the recipe that's employed, where the heads are removed, the the cut is made fairly high, all of that separated, and you're just left with a fairly high proof cuerpo, and then water's added to kind of stretch it and homogenize everything. Yeah, in this case, the inclusion of heads, hearts, and tails is a very traditional recipe in the region.
So are they adding water to make the methanol quota? I mean, I would think they would want to use as much liquid as possible. I mean, even if they're industrial, to maximize the product. I mean, are they just using water so they can get certified?
Yeah, primarily, because it's really a small amount of water that's needed to adjust that ABV down. But it helps immensely in passing a test if you're perhaps a little bit above some parameter. One of the cases here actually with the extended fermentation, I think, had to do with the cook time, because in March of last year, temperatures were fairly warm and stable. And so it wasn't like it was cold and the tinas needed the fermentation tanks needed extra time to get going. But it was really like a well-cooked agave. And the brothers took care of scraping off the really charred parts, which generate furfural in the fermentation and reveal themselves when it's fully distilled. And so even though it is a very sort of like quote unquote traditional recipe, I think that the sort of proof is in the pudding, and in the chemical analysis, the results were very, clean by these sort of modern chemical standards, but didn't deviate at all from their normal means of working, except for perhaps separating some of this charred agave. But the well-cooked agave Tepextate also requires more heat because of its water content and size. So that type of cook does require extended fermentation times.
So does removing the charred part make it taste better, or is it just to get that chemical out of it?
I wonder sometimes if furfural is one of those like extra special flavors, but I honestly can't tell between batches that comply with standards or that exceed standards, and producers seemingly can't either. It just shows up in the lab.
Can you say again what region this is from?
Sorry?
Where?
Yeah, the region. Yeah, Neta, we only work in Miwatlan. So 2.5 hours south of, or 2 hours south of Oaxaca City.
And everything comes from the region of San Luis Amatlan, which is the municipio that pertains to this particular area.
Very technically speaking, the region is the Sierra Sur, and then we're in the district of Miwatlan and in the municipality of San Luis Amatlan. So just to be like very technical, that is, in most of what Neta, we work with a village in the San Luis Amatlan municipality called Bogoche, and along with maybe 3 other producers in neighboring villages.
This is delicious. I love the Tepextate taste, and I love the idea of kind of that terroir idea of them all growing in the same ground in the same area, and you mixing together the different type of agave, because it's just, what grows together goes together, and it's
exactly.
What's a typical capone time for Bicuixe and Logoche?
Well, Nico,
Anywhere
I mean, like
1 to 3 years, but this
1
family
to 3 years
this
has a shit ton of
parcel-
3 years.
Yeah, this one parcel, as Nikki mentioned earlier, has a lot of capone Bicuixe, and every, what is it, April or May, I guess, they harvest enough for 1 or 2 tinas of a 2 or 3 year capone Bicuixe, because they have quite a bit of Bicuixe, and the plant is really robust, and it's one of the most like sort of definitive plants in the region, and it's very arid, so its defenses for the environment are significantly greater than an Espadín, for example. And so you can cut the flowering stock and leave a Bicuixe in the field for up to 3 years before it gets picudo or attacked by the various plagues. Whereas an Espadín, a lot of times you can't really go beyond a year because the plant becomes susceptible to infestation, and then that translates to a lower sugar count and a lower yield.
Doesn't it start rotting, or it's just infestation that kills it?
Also rots. It can also rot. It's like a bell curve. So yeah, if you leave it too long in the field, it can start degrading.
Should we move on to the Lalo mezcla, or does anybody have more thoughts, questions on the Neta?
I have one question. Is there any more of this that exists, like for purchase, or is it all? I mean, because I think this is like freakishly good. This is one of the best I've ever had. Is that's kind of it? Like, what's sold is sold, and kind of what's done is done at this point.
Yeah, the whole batch went to y'all in the mixtape. So we'll definitely be releasing more mezcales from Eliazar, from this family, of some also interesting and hopefully equally as delicious in your eyes ensembles. But this is all we got.
Yeah, I think the people think about terroir with these batches, and I think almost as important is just the time. And you can have another batch with the same blend of agaves from the same plot of land, and whether it's just the place that you're at when you drink it, or in your life, or that particular season when it was fermented and distilled, for better and worse, savor every bit of it, because when it's gone, it's gone. And you might get something that you like better, or you might get something that is just as good, but it will never be, quite that again.
That's what makes it so special.
Indeed. So this Cuishe-Espadín from Lalo, this is the second batch of this particular mezcla that I've had from him, and both of them I think have been among my favorites that I've ever had from Lalo. I think maybe it's just the novelty of not having seen this particular mezcla from him a bunch, but I think these two magueys work so incredibly well together, especially in his hands. Those of you who have been in Mixtape for a minute, we've had, I think every single batch from Lalo has been either a 2 or 3 maguey mezcla so far. So we've definitely talked about his philosophy and his thinking on, or just his general approach to what works together and why he wants to marry 2 agaves together. But if you haven't gotten a chance, if you go on the Mixtape website, there's a YouTube video with Lalo talking about this stuff in his own words, and much more poetic than I am at all times. But certainly when he's talking about his own work, it's nice to hear it directly from his mouth. So if you guys haven't seen it yet, I would definitely encourage you to check that out. I think if you've had his Cuishe before, and it's worth noting, I think we've had a couple batches that used his San Martinero, and like San Martinero, his Cuishe or Cuishe and Minas, just the nomenclature is worth noting that it's not a Karwinski like you might see in many places when people are talking about a Cuishe. So if you tasted this and thought this tastes nothing like a Karwinski, you are correct. It does not taste anything like a Karwinski. It's the same name being applied to Agave Rotacanta, which in many other places probably most commonly is known as Mexicano. So again, one of the many sort of interesting peculiarities of the world of mezcal, because these places are also fractured, or fractured from one another, I should say. They've all evolved in their own traditions, and with that, their own language. And so rather than homogenizing the language and homogenizing the practices and qualities and all that, it's a little bit extra complicated, but I think the extra complexity certainly comes back to you as far as getting to try so many like wildly different things. So his Cuishe and his Espadín, which is just Espadín, he talks about these working together nicely because the Espadín is laying down such a sort of sweet and supple base. And so it's sort of building the platform on which to explore the flavors and the qualities of the Cuishe. And I think that that's a really interesting approach to it, that, if you've ever listened to a song and then you've heard a remix of that song, or you've heard a cover of that song or something like that, you realize that there's maybe elements of that you didn't appreciate or that weren't accentuated in the original or in its pure form. And then when it's brought out by this other thing, whether it be through contrast or through comparison, there's a lot of stuff going on here that I don't necessarily focus on when I get his pure Cuishe. His pure Cuishe to me is a lot more chocolatey, and this to me is much more herbaceous, and not herbaceous is the wrong word. It reminds me of different teas, like dried woody things. He talks about bark and cinnamon in his tasting notes for this, and as usual, I agree. What do you guys think?
Man, when I first tasted this, I got tropical fruit. I got like guava and papaya, like random tropical fruits that I don't taste that often in mezcal, and candy canes for some reason, like that sort of sweet, minty Christmas candy cane. It's great. I like it more and more as I sip it. Now I'm kind of tasting some grapefruit, but
yeah, I get some of that grapefruit
like
pith for sure, or like just grapefruit bitters if you're a cocktail person.
Right.
This is like a Fee Brothers grapefruit bitters maybe.
Oh, I
Ben,
can see the cinnamon too. Yeah.
Ben, is this a blend of different Cuishes, or is it just like one particular type? I know in Minas they have different.
So, I mean, I would guess that in Minas, or I shouldn't say in Minas, but certainly when it comes to Lalo, he's differentiating between 5 different varietals of Cuishe. And if you were to go to many other places, and Lalo, if you brought Lalo to many other places, he would probably tell you, oh, these are the 5 different varietals that you'll see here. But when it comes to most other places, they're just saying, oh, that one looks a little bit greener or more yellow, or it's larger, just in the way that
Lo mismo pero
it's
diferente.
natural. Exacto.
Same but different.
Exactly. So these were both from Cuishe Verde. There's Penca Larga and Penca Corta, and this includes both of those two. Cuishe Amarillo, there's almost none of it. When Lalo was at my house here in Los Angeles in like 2017, maybe, I had a couple bottles of Cuishe Amarillo that I bought from him from 2014 batches, and I think that was the last time that he'd made it. And he was all excited to get to drink it, and I gave him one of the like 3 bottles that I had, and then I happened to be in Minas like a month later, and of course he's like, what do you want to drink next? I was like, you got any of that Cuishe Amarillo? And he's like, nope, I drank it as soon as I got back. It's gone. There won't be any more of that for, you know, another 2022, 2023 or something like that. So there's several or I should say 5 different sub-varietals that he recognizes. The 2 that are used here are the 2 that prefer to grow typically in flatland. They like to grow in the milpa. As he says it, they won't grow if they're not next to corn. So if you were to plant these iwelos on their own, or plant them on a hillside among grasses or trees or something like that, they wouldn't thrive at all. So it's pretty interesting how different their needs can be from subvarietal to subvarietal, when seemingly, you know, in other places people aren't recognizing or differentiating between them, and maybe not getting the best out of those plants because they're just not nurturing them in the right way.
So if he's using a Cuishe in the mezcla, is he also going to say, all right, as the Cuishe part of this mezcla, what blend of these different types of Cuishe am I going to put in there? Like maybe 5 piñas of this, 5 piñas of that, or does he just pick what's right?
When it comes to the Cuishe Verde, the 2 subvarietals of Cuishe Verde, he doesn't, at least I haven't seen him do batches that are exclusive to one or the other. He'll include both. As far as their flavors, he doesn't think that they're particularly different. It's more just recognizing that these are slightly different types of plants. When he's making mezclas, those are the 2 that he'll use, just because they're more commonly found around there. If you're talking about other Cuishes that are harder to come by, that are more rare or more extinct, I think it would pain him to do anything with that but to make a pure batch. He's
Okay.
such an obsessive over plants. And really his reputation in the world of mezcal has been for making single varietal batches to get away from what's sort of the classic route of using the plants that are ripe at the same time or ready at the same time, and really focusing more on the qualities of the producer or the qualities of the region than, say, the qualities of that specific varietal. And so when he really dove down this rabbit hole of making a bunch of different mezclas and doing these experiments, it was a real sort of departure from his reputation. But of course, when you hear him talk about it, he's doing this maybe more old school thing, but he's doing it from the point of view of somebody who's obsessed with the specific qualities of these specific different species. So it's pretty interesting to see. I'm not sure what the right analogy for it would be, but you know, somebody who's an offensive player playing defense or something like that, doing the thing that's outside of their wheelhouse, but approaching it with a sort of like unique mindset that that produces unique mezcal in the end.
So he was saying that his favorite agave is Arauqueño. I never asked him what his second favorite is. Have you ever asked him that?
I'm not sure. You know, I think he loves Tobalá. He loves Tobaziche. I think, generally speaking, if there's anything he loves more than plants, it's the village of Minas. And so anything that exemplifies Minas historically, that's generally his favorite. And so I would say probably Tobaziche or Tobalá. Tobalá is one that I think in the mezcla that we had last time, he talked about sort of how unique it was for him or anybody in Minas to have made a mezcla with Tobalá, that's something that people, not just in Minas, but generally in Oaxaca, really prize Tobalá for its curative properties, and it's just thought to be like a really special holy plant. And
doesn't he differentiate between Tobalá grown in the shade and Tobalá grown in the sun?
Sure. Yeah. There's Tobalá Orejon, which is like, you know, big ear Tobalá, and Tobalá Chino, which is like, you know, a reference to the thorns, which are curly. And so Chino likes to grow in the direct sun, and Orejon prefers to grow in the shade of oak trees. But then, of course, he will take it even further, and he'll talk about Tobalá Orejon de Monte or de Cerca. And so he'll talk about not only the subspecies of Tobalá, but also the specific growing conditions, which you'll see people, you know, the producers that Neta works with, for sure, those guys are paying close attention to what type of land it came from, what type of soil it came from. And so that's not necessarily unique to Lalo, but he's got a really sort of exacting mind and approach to all these things, which just generally speaking in the world of mezcal is not so common. Way more often you get broad stroke answers about stuff, or people's explanation is because that's the tradition, or that's the way I learned to do it, or that's how, you know, my family does it. And Lalo really wants to dissect, okay, well, why is this the tradition, and why do we do it that way? And let me try some other ways. And if it's better, it's better. And if it's worse, it's worse. But I just want to understand what is the relationship between the plants and the soil, and the plants that are growing next to them, and the fertilizers that we're using, and the animals that we're raising to get that manure, and so on. And it's really pretty impressive, all the different little variables that he's always tinkering with.
Are there any young mezcaleros in Minas that he's mentoring that we should look out for? Like, I know Neta has been featuring a lot of young mezcaleros, and they've been great. I'm just wondering.
He, you know, he's never humble about what he's doing in Minas, and he really thinks that aside from making great mezcal, that people who enjoy good spirits are going to share and respect. He's running a school for people in that town, and he won't hire anybody to work in the Palenque who's not from Minas. He really wants to sort of like keep the tradition alive and support both the kids in that community, but also I don't think it's necessarily about like giving up trade secrets to outsiders or something like that. But I think there's a lot to be said for, you could be the hardest working, most dedicated, most capable person, but if you didn't grow up in Minas, you don't have the same connection, the same sensory memory to the water there, to the plants there, to all these little things that, while they may be making mezcal that's just as good somewhere else, it's just different. So he's pretty pretty committed to training the next generation of mezcaleros in Minas. There's a handful of guys that have worked for him for various periods of time, and then gone on to start their own brands or gotten hired by another brand somewhere else and work in Minas. And we're going to, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves and promise anything, but we're going to have a batch made by his daughter at some point, which will be
cool.
the only Lalocura not made by Lalo that we'll probably ever see. He very drunkenly, one of the last times I saw him, gave a whole speech about how he's only good because he tries really hard, that he doesn't have any natural gifts or talents when it comes to making mezcal. And that he gets by on his efforts, but that his daughter, she has like a very special nose and a very special palate, and she can appreciate things when she's composing batches that you know, he only wishes he could do. And he referred to her as the Maradona of mezcal, that she just had this God-given gift. And then she happens to walk in the room like whatever 10 minutes after he says that, and she's I think she's got to be 21, and goes to university in Mexico City, and is like very young, like hip kid who doesn't have time for her dad and his like weird friends that drink in the in the back of the house. And I said, "Oh, Daniela, we were just talking about you. Your father says that you're the Maradona of mezcal." And she's like, "Oh, great. Who's that? What is that? What does that mean?" So all
the
that
Ronaldo,
said,
the Messi.
exactly. Yeah, you'd have to pick like a rock band or something, and then she would know the analogy. But yeah, that's pretty exciting, and we've got a couple things that she's made, and we'll hopefully pick one of them out to share with you guys later this year.
Ben, could you or Max explain, in terms of whether it's Lalo or the Neta growers in the collective, where do the palenques, you know, where do the mezcaleros get the agave from? Do they have their own little family farm? Do they work with people in their village? Do they buy from folks? How do they acquire the agaves that might go into these little small batches?
Generally speaking, all of those ways. So, you know, there's no one size fits all answer. Lalo, for the stuff in this particular mezcla from Lalo, all of it came from his land, either land that he owns or land that he's like leased from one of his neighbors for a number of growing cycles. So he'll lease it for 20 years or something like that, get a couple plantings off of it and move on. He buys a very little bit of agave, and he's pretty particular about where he'll get it from and who he'll get it from. And you know, not surprising, somebody with as high standards as he has, he's not willing to just buy, you know, sort of commodity tier maguey.
Right, I just meant other people in the village. I didn't know if he bought from them or how that works.
Yeah, he'll buy from them. There's one community in Ijutla that he was getting some San Martinero from, that he thought that the quality of the land there was really similar to what you find in Minas. And so he felt like he wasn't betraying the flavors of Minas to use some of that. And if it meant that he could have that many more batches a year or whatever, that was a good thing. What about Neta, Max?
I think it's, you know, it really varies from family to family. It's, in some cases, maybe 70% of the agave they use is homegrown. In some cases, it's 100%. It has started to change. So there's excuse me, one of the most traditional ways of working, like the supply chain, involves working a medias, is what people call it. And so somebody might put up the agave who maybe didn't have the resources to actually palenquear, to make the mezcal themselves, and the agave would go to the mezcalero, and then they'd split the production or split the profits. that's a way that people still work in Logoche to some degree. And I think, you know, there's a Madrecuixe band that, well, I don't want to give too much away, but there's something coming up through the pipeline that Paula made that was agave that was purchased from her compadre, Chepe, who lives just like, I don't know, a kilometer down the river bend. So it's agave that's local in almost 95% of the cases, but the sort of web that connects the producers and the growers is often pretty extensive, and goes back in some cases multiple generations between family. Tomas and his family end up sourcing quite a bit of agave that they use from Santa Cruz, which is nearby, and it's where Tomas's wife Antonia's from. And so it's her family members who still grow a bunch of agave, but don't always turn it all into mezcal themselves. And so they sell some of that to Don Tomas. And in these cases, Tomas and others are often very particular about separating the agave that comes from somewhere else. Candido had a couple batches that were made that way that you guys got, Ben. Maybe you still have some right now, but he had the option of combining that agave with his own homegrown agave, but didn't want to do that because he knows that those flavors are going to be different, and so they got separated. So that's a early roundabout way of sort of saying, yeah, the agave comes from all places, but the preference is always homegrown. Pardon. And with a preference of homegrown and endemic species, but people do experiment.
All that said, Lalo is very not openly critical of specific mezcaleros, but just in general, if you don't grow agave, you're not a real mezcalero as far as he's concerned. You know, he's got this, you know, you're making studio gangster mezcal as far as he's concerned, that you're like jumping on the bandwagon and you're making money and you're selling to tourists. But if you're not growing agave, you don't really appreciate the full cycle of what it is. You know, you're sort of showing up at the last step and turning agave into money, but you don't really appreciate where they come from. And so whether people think it's delicious or not, you just don't have the craft for him to have a lot of respect for that. And again, you know, you can't argue with if something's delicious, it's delicious. But I think there is a lot to be said for really having an appreciation for the ingredients that you use in whatever business you're in or whatever craft you practice. So I think that's pretty wise on his part.
I like.
Yeah, and I think that it's also a part of the traditions of Minas and definitely Michoacán to be a grower and a distiller. That's not the case in some other communities for sure, where they were used to more to only wild harvesting, and certainly in other parts of Mexico, like Durango, where there's very, very little cultivation of agave happening, and more there's folks who go and collect from communal lands or from private lands, and then just process the agave. But yeah, I think that in the case of Neta and in Lalo's case, they're coming from traditions of grower distillers.
I like that, but I feel bad for like I just think of the poor little villager boy that like his family didn't have the resources traditionally. They weren't landowners. And so if he wants to be a distiller, like, I feel like, hey, shouldn't this be open to him too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's it's always a fair point when it comes to things that we sort of fetishize the traditional aspect of it or the historical aspect of it. And in most cases, people are just trying to make a living. So if somebody came to your office or your job and said, oh, well, you know, 40 years ago, people did it like this, and you're betraying the methods of your grandfathers. They might be correct in that, but at the same time, it's like, yeah, before you honor your traditions, it's nice to feed your family. So I think it is a little unfair of us to impose the standards of what it is that we as consumers or just fanatics think is important, and think that the producers should have the same priorities.
Yeah, and I think we have to look at all this through the lens of history as well, because I mean, what happened with land reforms in Oaxaca was different than what happened in the north, and a lot of folks didn't start really accumulating land, or weren't able to privately like acquire land until the 1980s or 90s. And in a lot of mezcal producing communities in Oaxaca, a lot of the land continues to be held communally. So just practices are really different from place to place. Where we are, people own land, but this was, you know, a relatively recent phenomenon.
I mean, doesn't it also have to do with like Durango? There's tons of wild agave left because there's not so many producers, and in Oaxaca, I mean, they've been out there taking agaves wild from the hills for so long. There's not enough left, and they have to plant them. Does that, I mean, come into play?
That's totally true as well. I mean, I guess the only simple answer is to say that all the real answers are complicated, and there's no sort of like one size fits all, whether you're breaking it down by region or economic status or what have you. You know, there's always a lot of different reasons why somebody would do something or not do something. But yeah, absolutely. In the case of Durango, I think just there's Cenizo growing everywhere. I don't think there's a price for what a kilo of Cenizo goes for, because nobody buys it. It's, you just walk up the hill and you take what you want. And certainly, you know, if the ratio of available agave to mezcal production was the same there as it is in Oaxaca, the price of Cenizo would be well established, and it would probably be really high.
So
In the case of Durango there, sorry, some of those land holdings are like 10,000 hectares. And the folks in Logoche, for example, the average land holding is like 3 hectares, 6 hectares. 1 or 2 families are in like the 20, in the double digits, but it's, you know, it's a really different story, as Nikki was describing.
Yeah, Pancho Villa and Zapata had very different visions of land repartition, and also being in the north, it's just a very different history. So yeah, the land holdings are much larger. What's the brand that has like, they have like an estate that's as big as Manhattan?
Lagrimas, yeah.
Lagrimas de
Herman
Dolores,
is like totally great guy. He comes from an old mining family, and I was with him and we're driving, and I'm like, well, how much further before we get to where your ranch starts? And he's like, oh, we've been on it. I'm like, well, how long have we been on it? He's like, oh, I don't know, the last 2.5 hours maybe. And I said, how big is it? And he was like, he said however many kilometers it is. And I was like he could see I was trying to make sense of how big is that actually. He's like, it's about the size of the island of Manhattan. Like, that's a ranch.
Yeah, land holdings are also much larger in Jalisco, which also explains, you know, the history of tequila in a different way than mezcal in Oaxaca, which is indigenous, you know, largely indigenous and divided between 16 different ethnicities. So it's just complicated.
But complicated is also another way of saying it's deeply interesting. And,
it's exactly, which is why we're doing this.
If there was a one size fits all answer, you guys probably wouldn't need to waste 2 minutes of your time on a Monday night, let alone, you know, an hour and a half. And we'd all be drinking Pisco or something more interesting. So I guess thankfully it is complicated.
one quick question on at least on the distillation process. I was lucky enough to go down to Oaxaca and visit Max, and we went down to a Palenque in Minas, which also had a clay pot still. And I noticed that this is, another clay pot still. And is that just a regional thing, or are there copper stills in Minas as well?
I've never seen anybody working with anything but clay pot stills in Minas. I think almost everywhere you'll go, there's not a lot of diversity in equipment or production techniques within that village. There's a couple, I think Don Amato in Minas is the only one that uses a steam oven versus a pit oven. But I think outside of that, everybody in Minas is making things in the same basic process as Lalocura.
Yeah, I think Mina uses copper.
Oh, Mina, okay.
But yeah, that's
What
like
about
kosher in Minas.
I noticed when I went to Felix Angeles, who's in Minas as well, he uses a shredder while Lala does the old-fashioned mallet technique, right? I mean, does that differ in Minas a lot, or is it mostly like ancestral, no mechanical shredder type of thing?
Oh, you see a ton of shredders in Minas.
Okay.
I think when Lalo's presented batches where he cooked things together, took half of it and mashed it by hand and half of it and ran it through a shredder, and then fermented them in separate tinas and distilled them at the same time, really trying to like isolate the variable. You can absolutely tell the difference between the two, but it's a very subtle difference. And I think, if he wanted to try to pass something off as having been through a shredder or having been mashed by hand, I don't know that there's anybody other than him that would be able to taste it and go, oh, no, this is run the other way. Is that your experience, Nikki or Max?
Yeah, I think so. I can't definitively tell, what's been through a tahona or a shredder or a mash by hand, but they do require different recipes and fermentation. And something that's been mashed with the stone wheel or by hand is going to require less water, because you're generally able to gather up more of the juices that come out from that pressed or smashed agave. And so folks in Logoche definitively use more water in their fermentation tanks than somebody like Lalo or Conejo in Minas. But in terms of flavor, I don't know. That's tough.
And are you able to distinguish a different flavor from a clay pot distillation versus a copper pot with, the same methods, the same agave, same terroir, etc.?
Yeah, definitely. It just requires drinking a lot of them side by side, preferably.
If you're willing to do the research, yeah, you'll get there. You don't have to have a Maradona type palate to figure it out.
Yeah. I think that there are definitely differences, and also just in the kind of like the way that it feels in your body. I find that there's I can usually tell between clay and copper. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the clay really stands out for me, for sure. Especially, and also with the people that use the refrescador, I get a lot cleaner flavors out of refrescador for some reason. I don't know.
That's the idea.
Okay.
For sure. Speaking of things that were distilled with a refrescadera, do you guys want to move on to the Madrecuixe Puntas from Felipe?
I just have to say, this one is my favorite agave mixtape of all the batches. Like, I don't know, there's something about this that's just so beautiful. I mean, I don't know, it's somehow light but yet deep and so flavorful as well. I got all these like dried fruits, like dates and
Wow. It's different.
like fig. It reminds me of fig Newtons and like dark brown sugar and caramel and
Fig
it's
Newtons is a
just
great note.
beautiful.
Yeah. I think Puntas in general is just a treat. These Puntas I think are exceptionally good as well, but you know, I think for even those of us who have had tons of mezcal and visited tons of places, it's still relatively rare that you're sipping Puntas, or if you go somewhere that you're gonna get to try multiple kinds of Puntas. So it's something of like a delicacy, I guess, in the world of agave nerds for sure. And I think sort of what Raquel was saying, it's this really like ethereal beverage. There's tons of stuff going on, and it's kind of hard to define, and it's both like super light and super intense, and it is this balancing act between extremes in sort of every by every metric. You've got things pulling in both directions. So Puntas in general, I love. This batch I really love, and that's why we thought it would be cool to share with you guys.
So a lot
So-
of Puntas are really, really, really high alcohol, but this one is totally manageable. I mean, 56.5. What's the reason for that? Like, why
So
is it low?
generally speaking, if you're talking about a batch of Puntas, there's no batch of Puntas, right? Like that's a fraction of a distillation that's going to be used as an ingredient, or ingredient's the wrong word, but used as a building block for composing a more complete batch that includes colas and includes cuerpos or cortizones. And so in this case, Felipe knew that he was going to keep this separate from the rest of that distillate. And so I think he made his Puntas cut significantly lower, or not significantly, but a few points lower than he might have if he was planning on using this as 1/3 of a batch that he was going to compose. I think this is a great example of sort of the effect of tourism, or the effect of mezcal's popularity, and how that sort of reshapes tradition, where nobody in Mengali where this is made is really like buying Puntas from anybody else. If you're hanging out at a palenque, for sure, people are drinking it, and there's, you know, everybody has stories about their cousin coming over and then like falling asleep in a ditch because they came over when they were doing a second distillation. Somebody had like a whole copita of Puntas and like knocked out somewhere. But that's not something that's in commerce or is necessarily like a part of their drinking tradition so much. On the other hand, I think the reaction that you guys are all having, and that I have when I get to drink it, is it makes an impression on the mezcaleros. So anybody who's had people come visit them, any mezcalero that's shown their work to tourists or visitors from outside the community, has seen the reaction that it garners. And you know, Felipe, being a pretty sharp guy, was like, oh, I bet people would be excited if I had more of this, and it wasn't just a little taste, but maybe I could sell them a liter of it or something like that. And so he saved the Puntas from this particular batch of Madrecuixe and used the rest of it. He wanted to do 2 experiments. One was to do this batch of Madrecuixe, this batch of Puntas that he would sell on its own. And the other experiment he wanted to do was to make a pechuga, which is not at all something that's traditional to that region. But his brother makes a pretty good living making pechugas, And so I think he thought, well, what the hell, why don't I try 2 things at once and sort of use all the parts of the buffalo.
I don't know how people work in Mango. What we're all calling puntas, they actually, most people will divide into puntas, what they call puntas de primera, segunda, y tercera. And they're like 3 separate, very distinct cuts within sort of the heads category. And that can be anywhere from around 55, 58% in like what is puntas de tercera, which is very drinkable. Puntas de segunda in like the 60s range often. And then people with what people refer to as puntas de primera is often the like 70%, the 60, 66 and above. And so yeah, if you're making a pechuga and refining for a second time, so a third distillation, you wouldn't want to add those puntas because you're just gonna have a really high ABV final product. So that makes good sense, separating and selling on the side.
So I saw someone was asking what are puntas. It's the first liquid to come out of the distillation, right, with the highest alcohol. And is that correct?
Yeah, there's a small amount that's separated. If you're using, you might know more about this with the clay. I don't know if the cuts are the same quantity-wise, but with copper, you definitely need to remove a certain amount of the very first liquid. People call it the cabezas, tainted with the copper. It's very difficult to clean out all the intricate copper piping and whatnot. And so effectively, you just get a liter or so, whatever, depends on how big your batch is, but somewhere around a liter is going to have a kind of bluish or greenish tint to it, and it's highly toxic. Separated and gets used for topical remedies for arthritis and muscle pains, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think for anybody who's coming to agave spirits from whiskey, when people there are thinking of heads, they're thinking of 4 shots, they're thinking of things that are toxic generally and are removed because they have too much methanol in them, there's something actually poisonous about them, or simply the flavors are not desirable. And so to clarify a little bit further, when we're talking about puntas, we're talking about the first stuff to come off of the still that's considered desirable and drinkable. We're not talking about, we didn't send you a bottle of methanol and poison.
And also that's the second distillation, right? It's not on the first distillation.
Exactly. Depending on the equipment that somebody's using, there might only be 1 distillation. And so, I've had
say these guys use refrescador, right?
They do. So they're using refrescadera, but they're using it in a way where they're still doing 2 passes through it.
Oh.
So if you see, the single pass stuff is mostly from Ihutla, and people there use plates in the still. So it's more of a column still sort of concept. How many guys do you work with with Neta that do single pass mezcal?
On a commercial level, 3 to date, but know quite a few different people that use the refrescadera, and they all have very different recipes and even very different definitions of puntas. I think what this is here, La Mal Bien, is more in line with what we're thinking of puntas, but I do know people that save, they set all of the low grado, the very low liquid that comes out that doesn't produce the cordon will get set aside. And at the end of the season, when there's enough of that to refine, whatever, the end result there gets puntas. And that's often between 50 and 75% alcohol. And so the definition does kind of change a little bit from village to village, especially with the refrescadera. There are just a million ways that you can use this this equipment, and every family kind of has their own techniques. And yeah, within Miahuatlan, I really couldn't tell you how many different recipes there are, but it's like somebody's mole, like it's different in every household.
Yeah, I think again, the complexity of the category, I think is to me its greatest virtue. And there's no textbook, there's no university that people go and get indoctrinated at and say, this is how you use this piece of equipment. When you buy a still, it doesn't come with instructions, right? So for better and worse, everybody's got their own way of doing it, and some people have really mastered it, and some people haven't. And you know, most people are just doing something that's slightly different and not necessarily better or worse.
What does everyone think about this? I mean, I think this is just fantastic.
Well, I think I have
What do
about
people
3 more
think?
minutes before I pass out because it's so
Fair, very fair.
This is one of the few mezcals that I've had that I get layers on the palate, and I get a creaminess up front, and then I get the heat, but then the finish is very smooth. And I find that unusual because usually when I get some heat, it lingers. Would that be possibly because of the puntas, or just anything else that you think would create either the layers or the heat and then the smooth finish?
I mean, compared to high ABV spirits in other categories, I feel like agave spirits generally present as being, if not lower ABV than they are, certainly more palatable. And when you see 56.5 on a bottle of bourbon, you're like preparing yourself for a very different experience than what you get when you sip something like this. Whether that has to do with glycerin content in agave spirits versus things distilled from grain, I don't know what the scientific answer to that question is, but I definitely agree with you that this it's not a palate wrecker in the way that you might expect it to be.
A lot of in the case of agave, a lot of esters and the really tasty volatiles are coming out in the puntas. And I think it's kind of the opposite with most grains and with fruit, if I'm not mistaken. And so you really do find these an incredible sort of condensation and sometimes slightly different flavors in the puntas that you're just not going to find in the fully composed batch. And you know, we've been referring to puntas and mezcal, and for the mezcalero, there is a big difference in, like, the terminology is super important. The mezcal is the liquid that produces the cordon, these kind of that proper pearly, bubbly action, and the liquid that's higher, that's the puntas, and then the liquid that is lower is referred to as the cola, the ordinario, or chiche, or común, just kind of depending on the region. But the terminology is also just kind of interesting and worth noting.
So if I may offer my perspective, I'm not affiliated with any brand. I'm just somebody that enjoys drinking mezcal. I've tasted a few puntas, and this one coming from a refrescadera, it's, in my mind, it's very typical that what we're tasting, because I share your experience. It's very creamy on the front. It has a little heat, but then it kind of dissipates. And I feel that mezcales that are distilled in a refrescadera tend to be a little more gentle. So I get to taste a lot of the different layers and subtleties. So for this one, even though it's 56.5, it kind of hits you, but you get that creaminess up front, and it builds up to the heat, but then it's so high in alcohol that it kind of dissipates really fast, and there's not a lingering spiciness or kind of chemical flavor. That's my experience from a drinking, not from a professional perspective.
Yeah, I think to what you were saying, and sort of to what Max was saying, I think if you're looking at a finished, a fully composed batch of mezcal that you would more commonly find in a bottle, all of these flavors from the Puntas are there. They're just kind of blown out by everything else. And so when you strip the bass line out of the track and we strip the vocals out of the track, you can hear that like really sort of delicate set of high notes that when you're listening to the whole thing put together, it's there, but you just don't have the ear for it, or you can't appreciate it, or it's being overpowered by all these other things. So it is separate from its deliciousness, just an interesting exercise in considering how many other flavors are in all the bottles of mezcal that you have at your house that you're just not able to detect underneath some of those like bigger, more robust or louder flavors.
Yeah, the analogy I've used when talking to people is that pot still does to alcohol what a prism does to light. And I feel like this is a really interesting way of like capturing just like a few of those like pieces of light rather than blending it all together in a final batch. It's super fascinating, and to the point of it being kind of creamy, it blows me away because I come from more of like a history of understanding, you know, Scotch and bourbon, and you know, you don't get that like richness off of like a head when you're drinking, you know, a malt distillate. And I think that has a lot to do with like how much severe reflux there is in bourbon, and just those like heavier oils don't make it through. But when you're dealing with like live fire on a tiny little still in comparison, I think you have the opportunity to push those oils through a lot better. At least that's what I would guess. Does that make sense?
Wow, that's a great description. I love that. Prism.
Yeah, there's a lot of differences, and as somebody who myself sort of arrives at agave spirits through an understanding of whiskey and you know, always is I'm always having to challenge the assumptions that I make about how the process works based on my understanding of what's fundamentally the same process, but using a completely different base of ingredients. You know, I think specifically when we're talking about Puntas, anybody who's learned about whiskey, you have this idea that it's methanol, ethanol, propanol, right? Like those are the orders that alcohols come off of a still in. And when you're talking about agave spirits, I'm certainly not a chemist, and I wish that I had. If one of you is a chemist, I will give you all the mezcal you want if you let me harass you about this for a couple hours. Mezcal or agave spirits are full of azeotropes, which means that the methanol gets blended in such a way that it actually comes off on the back end of the distillation. And so your colas will be heavier loaded in methanol than your four shots or your puntas would be, which to my like high school chemistry education sounds impossible, because you go, well, the molecular weight of methanol is lower than that of ethanol, so shouldn't it rise more quickly under lower heat? But again, you know, limited by my own understanding, and I think we're all limited sort of by the research by real scientists and experts.
Is there a part of the distillate that's kind of more associated with the nose? Because I find this like for as high ABV it is, that it has a much lighter kind of nose than I expected.
Definitely. Colas are generally more expressive aromatically, where Puntas, you have all these great flavors, but there's really not a ton going on. I mean, you can certainly smell it if you stick your nose in the glass. It smells like something other than just straight alcohol, but that's not where the dynamic flavors are, or the dynamic aromas are, I should say. And I think that really plays a big part when the more you can appreciate what's in this bottle here, the more you can appreciate the art of composing a finished batch of mezcal, in that your lack of colas will result in a lack of aromatics, or a potential lack of aromatics. And so if you wanted to just raise the ABV on your finished product, or you wanted to bring out more of these floral notes that you're getting in the puntas, it would come at the expense of something else, right? Like you can't fill that finished bottle with more from one without making less room for the other. Otherwise, you would just say, I make all my mezcal at 48%, and I take the center cut, and then I just doctor it up until I hit 48, and I'm done. Which I'm sure somebody does somewhere for something more industrial, and it's probably not 48, it's probably 38, but you know, not for people that are nerding out on it, at least.
Ben, you know exactly that's how a lot of mezcal is made.
Yeah, just not the stuff that we're going to talk about tonight or ever, probably.
65% and water. But I think that, yeah, generally you don't, if you pour out these puntas and you let them sit for an extended period of time, you really will start to notice the aroma side. But I think generally that ABV is just so strong that for me, there's like an OD puntas. This is a little bit lower ABV than what you might find sometimes at Palenques. It's like 65 to 70%. But you're totally right in that observation that the aroma and flavor doesn't always equate with puntas. But again, a little bit of time is always.
So does Felipe
Mary,
still have some more of this at his Palenque, or did you buy it all? Because once I
we
get my
bought it
second
all. We
vaccine.
bought it all. Yeah, we got all of this. I don't know that he's made or reserved another batch of puntas from his production so far this year, but this is the second batch of puntas we've bought from him. So I'm sure that there will be a third, and if you get there before Anthony and I, you can probably snag yourself a couple liters of it, or you know, maybe it'll find its way into a mixtape in the future, or you know, who knows, possibly even just on a shelf in a store.
So I had a question from earlier. I think it was like in the Lalo discussion about growing, and basically like you need to grow in order to distill as well or produce mezcal. What percentage, or I guess it's like community by community, but are people kind of like growing agave primarily and maybe only distilling as a little bit of like a side hustle or as a community thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think both. Like you said, you know, it's sort of that number would change based on what region you're in, what specific village you're in. In Guerrero, where we've been spending a little bit of time recently, they are more focused on how the plants are raised than how it's been distilled, which is really interesting. And so in all the stuff that we've bought there so far, the people who raise the plants are also the mezcaleros themselves. But in the case of a batch where the plants came from somebody else, they want the farmer, the magueyero's name on it next to the mezcalero's name, because they feel like this person produced the materia prima in the same way that if you went to a nice restaurant, it's not rare that they're eager to tell you about the ranch where they got their beef or their pork, or the farm that grows their mushrooms or whatever it is, because at the end of the day, like, garbage in, garbage out, right? And if you have something of exceptional quality, your job as the chef or the distiller is more to not screw it up, to get out of the way and let this beautiful plant express itself the way that it should be. So if you go to some place like Guerrero, yeah, you'll see a ton of people who are sort of, there's a clearer division of labor and people are doing one or the other. But in Minas, almost everybody that's making mezcal is also a grower of agave, and when they're not, you know, there's some thumbing of noses.
Are a lot of mezcaleros? I mean, I know I read from Neta this batch that I pre-ordered, this Tepextate from Aniceto, they were saying in the description that he's mostly a farmer, but he just makes a batch of mezcal, you know, once in a while. I mean, is that common? Are they farming food, fruits and vegetables, and
Yeah,
as well as making mezcal?
There are still quite a few people that make mezcal on a hyper seasonal basis, or in the case of Aniceto, just really small amounts. His oven is like a third, maybe half the size of some more common ovens, but it's maybe got like a 5-ton capacity at best. It's probably closer to like 4 tons. So it's really a fraction of the size of everybody else. He was working with just one fermentation vat for the last number of years. And so, you know, just intrinsically is very limited in how much he can produce at a time. But most people in the Miahuatlan region, I think, are first and foremost subsistence farmers. And only recently, with the change in price of agave and the value of mezcal, has that started to shift, where their primary source of income in the last 5 years is now mezcal. But in the past, it was really the surplus beans or corn or chile or whatever they had that they were selling on the side. So the dynamic really has changed tremendously. And going back 15 years ago, there were people that were dedicated to just the growing of agave, and there were people that pretty much just made mezcal. There was such an abundance that as a producer, there was no need to help with where you were going to source your material from. And you have these whole community networks that are supplying it. So you didn't need to necessarily grow your own. There are definitely cases where you had like hacienda owners that did have big holdings and could cultivate quite a bit. But in the case of Logoche, yeah, it was very different. I think the historical production chain has changed tremendously. And one of Comercom promotes when you attend their meetings is this really clear breakdown of the supply chain, where you have people who grow agave seeds and clones, and then you have somebody that grows them out in a nursery, and then you have somebody that grows them to maturity, and then you have the producer, and then you have the bottling facility. And the reality in most communities, you know, outside of the really big production zones, everybody does every one of those steps, and you have to, because there's no other alternative today. So there have been a lot of really drastic changes in the way people are working over the last 10 years. I think part of that is the demand syrup and what gets sent up to Jalisco for you know, processing in diffusers, and just various mixed tequilas and low grade products. So yeah, it's not your appreciation of these kinds of small batches that are creating the situation, but there's a larger dynamic at play that has dictated the way people grow and distill, definitively, in the case of Oaxaca anyway.
Can you tell the difference? I mean, you mentioned this between mezcal made from agave, grown from seed, and grown from clone. Has anyone done that?
I don't necessarily tell in the flavor, but I do have the suspicion that certain agaves that have been repeatedly grown from clone are no longer the same size that they used to be years ago. And so it requires more material now than they did in the past. Madrecuixe, for example, I've heard from Aniceto told me this, that when he was a kid, and I guess up until when he was a young man, let's say, it was 7 piñas of Madrecuixe to fill 1 tina. And I was just going over production notes today over a newer Madrecuixe batch that required 23 piñas.
Whoa, that's a huge difference.
And both, tremendous difference. And some of that can just relate to the soil type and what kind of treatment these plants have been getting, because it is a cultivar and requires some human intervention in maintenance more than anything, a little bit of extra water perhaps. But I think a lot of it has to do with people not selecting or not being hyper selective about which Madrecuixe gets propagated, because that's one that when you grow it out from seed, it's kind of a grab bag as to what type of agave you'll actually get, because it carries all these different genetics. But the rhizome is always going to be a true clone to the mother plant. And so it's inherently just easier to grab whatever rhizomes are around you than it is to kind of wait and find the ideal plant and propagate
And maybe it would be tempting for the mescalero to see the biggest, most healthiest agave and say, I'm not going to let that go to seed. I'm going to use that in my batch because that's going to give me the biggest yield. But if you pick, if you select for the best and you use the seed, right, that would be the way to go. I didn't even think of that.
Yeah, it's really often too tempting for a lot of mescaleros, but people that do have that consciousness about, I know Lalo's crazy about what he selects for seed propagation. And there are other people as well that are very discerning about that, but others definitively opt for the big chingon agave for the batch, and then the kind of runt that's next to it is the one that they save for seed production. And, maybe it's a little more resistant to some type of bug, or has some other, those genes serve some other kind of beneficial purpose, but not for mezcal production, So there's maybe some other advantages to the type of selection that has been going on, but I think as a whole, people have not necessarily done a great job about continuing to select the biggest and best varietals, because the Madrecuixe itself is an example of selection and human intervention that happened God knows how long ago. And so there was a point where people were selecting very specific types of agave for very specific purposes or for multiple purposes. And I think that's a tradition that has kind of slowly disappeared a bit. And there, I'm sure, are many factors as to why.
Cool.
Sorry for the long-winded answer there.
No, totally interesting.
The only good answers are long answers. Do you guys have any final thoughts or questions about the batches for volume 4?
I'll just say
Does anyone
that
have any favorites?
I've been in it since the beginning, and really appreciate you guys putting this together, because I know that it's an opportunity to taste some things that you're not doing in larger formats. I mean, I'm here in New York, so obviously, there's a good market for mezcal here. And, this format is available to people, presumably, I would think, anywhere in the United States. And, I appreciate you guys putting this together. So thank you. I'm enjoying it a lot.
Thank you. Without you guys, Max and I and Nikki would be sitting around drinking agave and talking about it. We just wouldn't have 30 other people to talk about it with. So thanks for not letting us get lonely.
Yeah, enjoy in good health. Hi.
Well, cool. Thank you guys for joining us tonight. Thank you for being part of Mixtape. And if anybody has thoughts or comments or any of that, you can get in touch with us on Instagram, Agave Mixtape at pueblodesabor.com, agavemixtape.com. There's none of you are 100 years old. You know how to reach us. Oh, cool. Thank you guys for being here.
Any questions, please reach out. We'll see you.
Thanks a lot, Max.
Cheers.
Salud.
Appreciate it.
Let's eventually do an agave mixtape tour of Oaxaca.
Ooh, that's a good idea.
Oh man, that is not like I have any shortage of post-COVID fantasies, but that's a good one. That's a very good one.
Yeah.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
See you all soon.
Bye.
Buenas noches.
Yeah.